On the night of September 1st, 1858, on the eastern shore of Staten Island, New York, a crowd gathered in the darkness carrying torches, straw, tar, and cans of a flammable liquid called camphene. They were not a foreign army. They were not criminals in the ordinary sense. They were local residents, respectable townspeople, some of them led by men of standing in the community, and they had come to burn down a hospital, not an abandoned building, a working hospital full of living sick patients, men, women and children suffering from yellow fever and other diseases. The crowd's plan was to break through the walls, remove the patients, and set fire to every structure inside until the entire complex was reduced to ash. Over the next 2 nights, that is exactly what they did. And here is the part that's almost impossible to believe. When the men accused of leading this were later put on trial, a jury effectively let them walk free. This is Dark Diagnosis Files, and this is the story of the Staten Island Quarantine War, the time an American community burned down its own hospital. To understand why, you have to go back and understand what this place was, and why the people living around it had come to hate and fear it so deeply. In the early 19th century, New York was one of the busiest ports in the world. Ships arrived constantly from across the globe, and many of them carried more than cargo. They carried disease, above all, yellow fever, a terrifying illness that could cause fever, jaundice, internal bleeding, black vomit, and death, sweeping through a population in devastating epidemics. Yellow fever was one of the most feared diseases of the age, and for good reason. When it struck a city, it could kill thousands in a single season. Its victims suffered horribly. The jaundice that turned their skin and eyes yellow and gave the disease its name, followed in severe cases by the notorious black vomit, a sign of internal bleeding that very often preceded death. And crucially, nobody at the time understood how it actually spread. The true culprit, mosquitoes carrying the virus, would not be identified for decades, so people fell back on the most intuitive explanation available, that the disease spread through the sick themselves, through their breath, their belongings, their mere presence. If that's what you believed, then a compound full of fever patients next door wasn't a hospital, it was a reservoir of death waiting to spill over. To protect the enormous, growing city, authorities established a quarantine station. Any ship suspected of carrying contagious disease would be stopped, and its sick passengers offloaded and confined at a walled medical complex on Staten Island called the New York Marine Hospital, often known simply as the Quarantine. It was, in its time, one of the largest quarantine facilities in the entire country, a sprawling compound of hospital buildings behind a high wall, holding the sick so their diseases wouldn't reach Manhattan. And for the people of Manhattan, it worked reasonably well. The fever patients were kept at a safe distance, across the water, contained behind those walls. But for the people who actually lived on Staten Island, in the growing towns that had sprung up around the quarantine over the decades, it was a very different story. They were the ones living right next to a facility packed with the most contagious, dangerous diseases arriving from every corner of the world. And to their horror, the diseases did not always stay behind the walls. Repeatedly over the years, yellow fever escaped the quarantine and broke out in the surrounding Staten Island communities. People who had never boarded a ship, never traveled anywhere, sickened and died in their own homes because they had the misfortune of living near the place where the fevers were brought ashore. Local residents came to see the quarantine not as protection, but as a loaded gun pointed permanently at their families. For decades, the residents petitioned, protested, and demanded that the quarantine be moved somewhere less populated. They argued that it was unfair and dangerous to concentrate all of this contagion right beside their homes and their children. Their appeals went largely nowhere. The authorities had little incentive to move a facility that was successfully protecting the far more powerful and populous city across the harbour. There was also an economic dimension that sharpened the anger. Staten Island in this era was trying to establish itself as a place of desirable homes, of business, of respectable growth. Property owners and developers saw the quarantine as a permanent stain on the area's reputation and value, a facility that scared away investment and buyers and kept their community forever branded as the place where the fever ships came. So the resentment wasn't only about fear of death, real as that was. It was also about a community that felt its entire future was being held hostage by a facility the city refused to move. Fear for their lives and fear for their livelihoods fused into a single growing fury. Resentment built year after year, epidemic after epidemic. And by the summer of 1858, After yet another outbreak of yellow fever in the area, that resentment finally boiled over into something far beyond petitions and protests. The residents decided that if the government would not remove the quarantine, they would remove it themselves by burning it to the ground. The plan, by the accounts that survive, was not some spontaneous, chaotic riot. It was organized. Local leaders were reportedly involved. They gathered their materials in advance: the straw, the tar, the highly flammable camphene. They chose their night. And on September 1st, 1858, they moved on the quarantine. The group broke through the quarantine wall and poured into the compound. They overwhelmed what little resistance there was, and then they set about their grim task with a disturbing sense of purpose. They entered the hospital buildings where patients lay sick. Now, to their partial credit, and this is a genuinely important detail, the accounts indicate the mob did carry many of the patients out of the buildings before setting them alight, removing the sick and placing them outside, some on the surrounding lawns, rather than simply burning them alive where they lay. But make no mind of how orderly that sounds. These were gravely ill people, some in the final stages of fatal fevers, being hauled from their beds in the middle of the night and deposited on the open ground while their hospital was torched around them. Then came the fire. The rioters spread their straw and tar, doused the buildings with camphene, and set the quarantine ablaze. The wooden structures caught quickly, flames climbed into the night sky, visible for miles across the harbour. An enormous fire consuming one of the largest medical facilities in the country, deliberately set by the people who lived beside it. When firefighters and authorities tried to respond, the mob reportedly interfered, in some accounts cutting the fire hoses to prevent the flames from being extinguished. They had not come to send a message and leave. They had come to make sure the quarantine could never operate again. There are accounts of shots being fired in the chaos, of the small force meant to guard the facility being completely overwhelmed and unable to stop what was unfolding. The scale of it was extraordinary. This was not a single building set alight by a handful of vandals, but a coordinated assault on a large walled government complex carried out in front of witnesses, with enough organization and manpower to defeat every attempt to stop it. For one night, an angry community had effectively seized and destroyed a piece of the state's own medical infrastructure. But one night was not enough to finish the job. Some buildings still stood when dawn broke on September 2nd, so they came back. On the second night, the crowd returned to complete the destruction. They set fire to the buildings that had survived the first assault, working through the remaining structures until the Great Quarantine Complex, decades in the making, one of the most significant public health facilities in America, was almost entirely reduced to smoking ruins. Over those 2 nights, the patients who had been removed lay exposed on the grounds and in the surrounding area, their hospital gone, their care thrown into chaos. Historical accounts note that in the aftermath, amid all this, remarkably few deaths were directly attributed to the burning itself, but the sheer recklessness of it, the endangerment of dozens of already dying people, is staggering to consider. An entire medical institution had been violently erased by its own neighbors. In the aftermath, the state was faced with an extraordinary situation. A major government medical facility had been deliberately destroyed by an organized mob. Ringleaders were identified. 2 men in particular, prominent local figures, were charged in connection with orchestrating the destruction. And here is where the story takes its final, genuinely astonishing turn. At trial, the defense did not really deny what had happened. Instead, they argued that the quarantine had been a persistent, intolerable public health menace, a nuisance so dangerous to the surrounding community that its destruction was, in effect, justified as a matter of protecting the lives of Staten Island residents. The burning wasn't framed as criminal arson. It was framed as a desperate community defending itself against a deadly threat the government had refused to remove. It was, in essence, a legal argument that necessity outweighed the law, that when a government creates and refuses to remove a mortal danger to a community, the community has some right to remove it itself. It's a genuinely radical argument, the kind that in almost any other context would fail immediately. You cannot, as a rule, burn down a building full of sick people and call it self-defense. But this was a jury drawn from the very region that had lived in the quarantine's shadow for decades, sharing the same fears, the same losses, the same fury at being ignored. They were, in a real sense, being asked to judge people who had acted on grievances the jurors themselves almost certainly shared. The jury was sympathetic. The prosecution effectively collapsed. The men accused of leading the destruction of an entire hospital were not punished. The effort to convict them failed, and they escaped meaningful legal consequence. In the eyes of their community, and ultimately the court, they had done what the government wouldn't. They had removed the danger. So what are we supposed to make of a story like this? It's tempting to look back from our modern vantage point and simply condemn the mob, and the endangerment of helpless, dying patients absolutely deserves condemnation. Carrying feverish, vulnerable people out of their beds and dumping them on a lawn while you torch their hospital is a genuinely horrifying act, no matter the justification. But the fuller picture is more complicated, and that complexity is exactly what makes this a Dark Diagnosis Files story, rather than a simple morality tale. These were people who had watched disease escape those walls and kill their neighbors and children for decades. They had pleaded through every legal and peaceful channel available to them and been ignored because the interests of the powerful city across the water outweighed theirs. They were living beside what they genuinely, and not unreasonably, saw as a source of recurring death. The Quarantine War is what happens when public health policy collides with the terror of the people forced to live closest to disease. When a community's fear, however understandable, curdles into violence against the sick. It's a snapshot of an era before germ theory was understood, before we knew how yellow fever actually spread, through mosquitoes, not through simple proximity to the ill, when fear rushed in to fill the vacuum where knowledge did not yet exist. In the years after the burning, the quarantine function was eventually moved, pushed out to artificial islands and more isolated locations, away from the dense population that had risen up against it. In a grim sense, the arsonists got exactly what they wanted. The threat, as they saw it, was relocated. The violence had, horrifyingly, worked. Today, the site where the Great Quarantine once stood, where fever patients were unloaded from ships, and where a mob once carried the sick onto the lawn by torchlight, has long since been absorbed into the ordinary fabric of the borough. Most people who pass through the area have no idea that it was once the stage for one of the most extraordinary acts of collective violence against a hospital in American history. The story leaves us with an uncomfortable question, and it's one worth sitting with. When people are terrified of a disease they don't understand, what are they capable of doing to the institutions and the patients caught in the middle of that fear? In 1858, the answer was to carry the sick onto a lawn and burn their hospital to the ground twice, and then to walk free for having done it. Fear, when it outruns understanding, has always been one of the most dangerous forces in the history of medicine. The Quarantine War is simply one of its most literal, fiery examples. If forgotten chapters of medical history like this one fascinate you, please take a moment to subscribe to Dark Diagnosis Files. We dig up the real, documented stories at the dark edges of medicine, the disasters, the frauds, the mysteries, and the moments when fear and sickness turn people against each other. Your subscription is what keeps us investigating them. This has been a real, documented historical event. Every detail in this video is sourced from confirmed historical records and contemporary accounts. Dark Diagnosis Files investigates the horror that happens around hospitals and medicine. New cases every Sunday, Tuesday and Friday. Real, documented, told with the gravity they deserve. The townspeople feared the fever on the hill for decades, and on one September night, they decided fire was the only cure they had left.